Very happy to have you. Welcome to the 140th edition of Europe Calling. Yeah, bit of an anniversary today in cooperation with Member of Parliament Michael Bloss of the European Parliament. And we have three wonderful guests, and I'll introduce you to them in a second. Very happy to have you all on board. I'm Maximilian Fries, Managing Director of Europe Calling. What you'll see now is a slide, and that'll tell you what to expect tonight. As you know, what's happening with Europe Calling is that you can ask questions and rate the question of others using Slido. You can find the link and the QR code on the slide, but also in the chat. So feel free to ask your questions there, and we'll put then the questions with the most votes in the discussion. And of course, you can put your name to your question or somebody else's name, but yeah, anonymous questions aren't so nice. And as always, Europe Calling, our webinar is recorded. So whenever you ask a question or raise your hand to ask a question, just bear that in mind, that you'll find content online afterwards. So please bear this in mind. But this is all for housekeeping. We'll start right away with Professor Niklas Höhne. He is a special professor of greenhouse gas mitigation at Wageningen University in the Netherlands and a co-founder of the NewClimate Institute. You might have come across it, the Climate Action Tracker. That might sound familiar, and I'm sure he'll be saying a few words about that. We're very happy to hear the analysis of Professor Höhne. Thank you.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor to report about the COP, and I very much look forward to our discussion. Perhaps I'll start with an introduction. Now, what was very important is that this conference was overshadowed by the climate crisis, and this led to three things that are important to understand the climate conference. Firstly, most governments had other worries last year. Now, the process was originally that during the last climate conference in Glasgow, we'd have to do more, that all countries should present new goals in 2022. But because there was the energy crisis, there was no diplomatic push. So it wasn't like someone walked around to help ensure that more and more countries present climate protection goals. One idea in Glasgow was to also have initiatives with sectoral goals. Little was done to bring this forward, and one big problem is that China and the US didn't talk about climate protection, because only when the two talk will something actually happen in the global arena. So the framework conditions at a global scale aren't exactly supportive. And then there was also a gold rush for new gas infrastructure. All around the world, new infrastructure for gas is being planned, new pipelines, new fields, new LNG terminals. A massive overcapacity is being planned. If all of this is going to be built up, and if this goes up and running, then it will be impossible to achieve the 1.5 degrees target. But it's not only about the surplus capacity that is being built. Also, at a political level, there have been a lot of discussions as to whether the EU or individual member states should support Africa in generating gas. That is in contradiction with the climate agreement, but nevertheless, it is happening. On top of that, governments are paying part of the high energy costs of consumers and companies. So these are basically new environmentally damaging subsidies. So these are two negative points that have had an influence. There is one positive point, and that is that everyone now knows that the renewable energies is the long-term way out of the crisis. Individual states, including EU member states, have increased their renewable targets, and there's a lot going on in the area of hydrogen. So that's good, but nevertheless, the first 2 points overshadowed the latter. Now, the first question is, were there new climate protection proposals ahead of the climate conference or during the climate conference? You could see that on the left-hand side, and in total, only 29 countries submitted something, and out of these 29, we would say that only Australia is the only country where there were significantly changes, and Australia basically only did the homework over the last 12 months. Other countries submitted proposals, but it didn't lead to fewer emissions. Often because they're going to fulfill the newly proposed targets anyway. There was nothing from the big countries, China and the US. And the EU considered whether the 50% should become 75%, but there too, there was nothing official. So it must clearly be said that this process of increasing the climate protection goals failed, and it has now been postponed to the next year. So what was in it last year is once again in it. All countries are being asked to shift gears. Another point is to be found on the right-hand side. These are sectoral initiatives that happened because the British presidency invested a lot of time in setting these up. And these two were disappointing because in almost all of the initiatives, the important players are missing. There's a methane initiative where China, India, and Russia are missing, who are the biggest methane emitters. There's a Beyond Oil and Gas initiative where all of the major oil and gas producers aren't in it. And then there's a coal exit initiative. And as you could see, again, a whole lot of countries are missing. The same thing is the case for the emission-free vehicles initiative. The EU basically decided this. That is one of the good points of last year, but hasn't signed it yet. And one initiative that went backwards is the initiative where countries promised to stop financing fossil fuel projects abroad. And this obligation has now been broken by announcing that fossil fuel projects are going to be supported around the world, in Africa, for example. So that's a step backwards, which certainly isn't good. Now, what's the state of affairs with regards to the projected temperature increase? Now, the global emissions have risen because of Corona. There's a small slump in 2020, and that's how it should continue if we wanted to move towards our target of 1.5 degrees. So a halving of the emissions up to 2030. We're here, and we need to reduce this by 50% until 2030. What's the state of affairs? Well, we always look at the political measures that the countries have implemented. So not what they're promising, but what they're actually implementing. And here you can see that the global emissions are going to be stabilized and will hopefully go down in the second half of the century, but it won't suffice for 1.5 degrees. We will be at 2.6 degrees. Very little has happened over the last year. It is positive that the US passed a new law, but almost all countries increased their emissions in 2021. After the Corona dip, it went back up more so than was hitherto anticipated. Also with regards to the goals, nothing new happened, including during the conference. So no new 2030 targets. And if you take those and measure it up to 2100, we'll be at 2.4 degrees. That's better than 10 years ago, because we are now at 2.4 degrees. We were above 3 degrees before that, which is better, but not good enough. We also did not see anything major with regards to the long-term goals. Many economies set themselves climate neutrality goals. They either submitted these officially or not. Some only made political statements. And if all of that happened, we'd go all the way down to 1.8 degrees. That's the optimistic scenario. So the long-term vision is good. Almost all countries want to go to zero greenhouse gas emissions, which is good. So the long-term vision is good. But the big issue is the short-term issue, up to 2030. There's a huge target gap here between where we want to be, which is to reduce the emissions by half, and the actual state of affairs. So even with all of the proposals at hand, we are still emitting twice as much emissions in 2030 than would be required to achieve the 1.5 degrees target. And unfortunately, this didn't change last year. This is exactly the same image as 12 months ago. And if we take a closer look at this image, up to 2030, that's the same image here. And you can see the difference between what countries are proposing and actually doing. The fact is that there still is a huge target between promises and reality. Now, this begs the question, will we even manage to halve the emissions until then? And the reply is clear. If we continue along the same line, we won't manage. So we need to completely change things. And completely changing things, in my perspective, means entering the emergency mode. And the emergency mode would mean not making any mistakes, to not do anything wrong on the path there. So that would mean not building any new fossil fuel infrastructure, because of course it hampers transformation. And it would also mean not having any fossil environmentally damaging subsidies. That's the most important to ensure not going down the wrong path. But that won't suffice. We will still have to do things where today we perhaps think that they are beyond our imagination. And we showed this in the past, that we as a society can do things which in the past felt impossible. During the corona pandemic, from one day to the next, we started working from home. In the past, everyone thought that this would be impossible. And during the energy crisis, many governments have mobilized significant funds in order to mitigate the gas prices, which was also unthinkable in the past. And the same now has to be done for the 1.5 target. This includes massive investments into renewable energies, massive ones. One good example is ensuring that public transport becomes very cheap or almost free of charge. And you'd also have to think how regulatory measures can restrict emissions that aren't required. So we need a lot of courage and do things that are beyond the realm of our imagination. Then we will succeed. One last point with regards to finances, and here there was a bit of light at the end of the tunnel. For decades, there was discussions about having a financing mechanism for damages that countries have to suffer because of climate change, and this has now happened, which is great. It's still not clear how this is going to be paid out, but that it exists is a breakthrough, which in my opinion is of historic importance. There was also a start with this global shield, which is good. There was also a general discussion to reform the World Bank and IMF, which was also good. And then there was a lot of bilateral energy transition partnerships climate protection partnerships, so to speak, including 20 billion for Indonesia. There are some really good examples here, and I think we should carry along these ways. What's negative is that the goal to mobilize 100 billion still hasn't been achieved, and that one couldn't agree to another goal, and that it is once again possible for some to fund fossil fuel projects in developing countries. My conclusion is the following. Progress in the area of climate protection is not fast enough to achieve our target. The 1.5 degrees target is in intensive care with a condition that is deteriorating and can only be saved in emergency mode by doing the unimaginable. So we'll have to do things, again, that are beyond the realm of our imagination. I think this is possible, but we have to do it. 1 year, unfortunately, idled away when it comes to lowering greenhouse gas emissions. We're heading for 2.4 degrees, which would mean catastrophic climate change that must be changed à tout prix. A huge issue, in my opinion, is gas. There was a lot of support for gas, and the final declaration also didn't stop this. There was the idea to write down that coal, oil, and gas would have to be phased out, but this wasn't subject to consensus, which unfortunately is why it's not in the final declaration. But what is positive is the funding mechanism for loss and damages. So that means for me that next year we have to do a better job, because we can't afford another year as this one on our path towards 1.5 degrees. And there's 4 things that are important here. The presidency must do more. I'm not sure how this is going to happen, but that's extremely important. There must be front runners like the EU. The EU needs to get involved at an earlier point in time to present new climate protection goals. We must use these just energy transition partnerships. These have to serve as examples for ambitious cooperation, and what's very important is that the big ones enter into a dialogue, the US, China, and the EU. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Herzlichen Dank. Ich glaube, kann man zusammenfassen unter the science is clear.
Thank you very much. The science is clear. I think this is a very good way to express what's happening with a view to this climate conference. So we'll have 3 more inputs, 3 guests, speaking from a different perspective, different positions, and all 3 of them were at Sharm el-Sheikh joining the talks. I'm looking forward to hear your view on things. Perhaps you can provide an answer to some of the questions that Niklas Höhne asked at the end of his presentation. Do we need this emergency mode, like in intensive care? Mitzi Jonelle Tam, a climate activist in the Philippines. Very happy to have you. So happy. Working with justice activists and indigenous leaders. So happy to have your ideas.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. Our previous speaker already intensively explained what happened at COP27, but from the view of the climate justice movement, you see very different responses. Some people think that it was a complete failure because we were not able to address the fossil fuels that are causing the climate crisis. Some people think that because of the political climate in Egypt and the calls to free Alaa, one of Egypt's most well-known political prisoner, not being free during COP27, it was also a failure. Some people do see that there are victories that were won, and I'm one of those people. I think that we had a historical victory at this COP27, this UN climate summit, where we saw the impact of the climate crisis being talked about, being acknowledged. The loss and damage finance facility is so crucial because it shows that world leaders are finally understanding that the climate crisis is already here and not a problem of the future, that there are already impacts happening today and in history, because that's what loss and damage is. It's recognizing that we have already lost so much to the crisis that's happening today, and that's why there needs to be compensation. But as our previous speaker said already earlier, there needs to be money that's put into this fund. Right now, we have an empty bucket, and money needs to be put in it. And we have an example of the adaptation fund, for example, which has had this bucket or this fund for so long, but the $100 billion promise since 2009 that was supposed to be achieved in 2022 has still not been achieved. Only around $20 billion of climate adaptation finance comes every year. And most of that is in the form of loans and not grants, which means our countries go into debt to the countries that caused the climate crisis to deal with the climate crisis. It's almost as if you hit me with your car and now I have to borrow money from you to fix my car. It doesn't make sense. And add to that, remembering that it's not just the older generation that will pay for this debt, it's our generation and our children's generation that will have to pay into this debt because of the climate crisis that the older generation in the global north countries caused. It does not make any sense. And so climate adaptation finance, loss and damage finance, that has to be new and not reallocated. It has to be in the form of grants and not loans. It needs to be immediate. And again, this historical victory was only possible through civil society and grassroots movements and people's movements working every single day, campaigning every single day, even before COP27. It's so crucial to understand that COP27 is only one moment in our fight for climate justice. And at the conference, we saw how vulnerable countries came together to demand for this very crucial fund. And we saw how at first the EU was like, no, we don't want to finance a fund. We don't support it. And then in the end, through that unity of people and global South leaders, you saw the global North leaders starting to shift their positions also. And so we are calling on the EU and Germany to put climate finance, again, in the form of grants and not loans, because these are reparations. And it has to be public finance and not private or insurance-based. And I like to make this very clear. It's not the working class of Germany or the EU or the global North countries that should be paying up. It's the fossil fuel industries. We saw how the fossil fuel industry has profited so much. Tax these fossil fuel industries, tax these multinational companies, tax the richest people, tax the richest 1%, because these are the people, these are the companies, these are the individuals and groups that are causing the climate crisis. We saw how the investments into fossil fuels have continued to rise. So there is money to be put in, both in adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage. We need to take that away. We need to stop fossil fuel financing and subsidies, just as Niklas already mentioned. And talking more about human rights and civil society, we saw how civil society space really shrunk at this COP, at this climate summit, compared to different summits where you could protest outside. Here, we were limited within the UN space. And so for the first time in history, I think, we had the biggest People's Global Day of Action for COP inside the conference space instead of outside, which just shows how creative people can get when there's oppression and repression. People's voices get stronger. We find ways to keep pushing. We find ways to make sure that we can demand for justice. And that includes demanding for the freedom and democratic rights of people fighting for a better world, whether it be for climate justice or democracy. But that also includes realizing that fossil fuels actually cause a lot of human rights injustices. Fossil fuels kill. And what we have now is that we have a COP that has addressed the impacts of the climate crisis, but not the causes. So it's an analogy that I've been seeing is that the people on top have left their faucets open and the water is flowing and they're fine, but we're getting flooded here in the bottom level. And now they're saying, okay, here's a bucket and we're gonna put money into that and you can use that to adapt. You can use that to mitigate your loss and damages, but we're gonna keep the faucet running because it's not affecting us yet. So we have to realize that while the Loss and Damage Finance Fund is a victory, it will get harder to finance loss and damage and adaptation and mitigation if we do not drastically cut down emissions. If we do not stop the cause of the climate crisis, eventually people will have to pay so much just so that we can catch up, and we won't be able to catch up in the global south, especially if we do not cut down those emissions. And how do you do that? We need to stop all new expansion of fossil fuels. We need a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty that's global, that understands that we need to stop new infrastructures that means coal, oil, and gas. And I know Germany is still investing in gas fields outside of Germany. And you have communities like in Lützerath, where people are being displaced from their homes for a coal company and the coal fields that the coal isn't even being used that well because it's not like the best type of coal. So Germany is actually not using it efficiently even. So realizing that in your own home in Germany, there are injustices happening because of fossil fuels. It's not just happening in the global south. It's happening across the world that fossil fuels are killing, and we need to get rid of it completely, entirely in a just transition. So that means in the global north, you can already transition into a renewable energy system and then have technology transfer so that countries in the global south are able to develop, are able to transition into a renewable energy system and make sure that no worker is left behind. Overall, I think COP27 and the UN climate summits in general provide us a bubble of the world. I used to think that people who go to COP27 are the people who are most like us. Like, oh, when we're in here, it'll be the people who already know what's happening. It'll be the people who I completely agree with. And it's like an echo chamber and we're just preaching to the choir. But then I realized while I was there, that's actually the opposite. That's where you see the people who are completely against you. There you have the fossil fuel lobbyists. There you have the global north countries that refuse to pay up and put a dampen on climate action. And so we need to make sure that when pushing into this next COP, into the next conferences, into the next conversations, we have people there, the people most marginalized on every level, to make sure that we are included in the spaces so that we can create change for a world where no one is left behind. Thank you.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you so much. I love the image. You know, the faucet, the northern countries, they've got to close the faucet to stop the water running rather than hand out a bucket. I love that image because you're flooded. And I really love that image, and that'll stay with me, and I'm probably be using it. Thank you so much. That was a great statement. Well, let's continue with Ricarda Lang, the federal chair of the Greens, Bündnis 90, the Greens, and is also in the German Parliament. And she also joined the climate conference. I'm very happy to have you on board, Ricarda. So let's hear what your impressions were and what do you think these results, are they going to change anything in German politics? Thank you so much, Maximilian. Thank you. Niklas and Mitzi, I left a little earlier on Thursday night. And that was a moment when a lot of questions weren't answered and there was still hope in the air that there would be a fossil fuel phase out. A real pledge to that there will be the end of the fossil fuel production. And when I read the news on Sunday, where we actually are, it was like, oh, okay, that was a lost COP, a wasted COP. This was the 1 year, there were so many debates on the climate crisis, climate change, and there were so many hopes. As Niklas described, especially with the war in Ukraine, it's a fossil rollback, which catapults us back into a situation in which a climate conference is of great importance. And yeah, it just didn't live up to reality, the conference. And Mitzi actually, said this very beautifully, and loss and damage. It's a good thing to start with. Yes, it is a historic step, although a number of questions are still not answered. So this is a demand that we've seen over decades. Many activists and any civil society actors have, demanded that such a fund be set up. So for the first time ever, we have disagreement that yes, there will be a fund. Those countries contributed most to the climate crisis. They will have to pay up. So they have to take ownership financially. And those countries that hit hardest are supported. They receive help. So this is a historical step. And I think, I'm really frustrated how I was on Sunday anyway, but I think that was worth it, the COP. So there was a debate we had before. We're talking about a question that we heard very often. Did we focus too much on loss and damage? And was that the reason why we didn't talk so much about the reduction or the 1.5 degrees or adaptation? Well, what I can say is that the global north or countries like Germany, they were ready and prepared to go that way. And I think this sort of breaks the ground, prepares the ground to go further and take others by the hand. And that means that we need you to trust us, that we keep to our commitments, that we keep our promises. And this opens doors to cooperation. So strategically, I don't think it was a mistake to focus on loss and damage. I think this is the basis for many other steps to follow, and also to create alliances. What we see is that these alliances, looking at this year, looking at next year, they will grow in importance because there are so many big questions in terms of the global climate crisis finance. So will there be enough funds? There's nothing in the bucket yet to say. Look at the next 3 years, 2024. I think we will see many a debate. So this is why it's so important that we create alliances also with European countries, with the countries hit hardest. What we also noticed during the COP is that China has taken over a difficult role, and the same is true for Arab states. China, during the debate on loss and damage, sort of has seen itself in a role as, on the developing country side. And then on the other hand, we have this idea of, we need to close the faucet to not create more damages. And this is, the basic thing to do. So it's sort of this dichotomy, the global north, the global south. It's not like two groups are confronting each other, and this is not going to work. And this has to be the focus on loss and damage. The funds need to flow to those countries who are hit hardest, and not to states like China, who have now, been seen as one of the most the largest emitters. Now, with loss and damage, we have started a path, we have created chances and opportunities. We need to pick them up, we need to use them. Looking at COP, I think it was possible to find a solution in the sense that, looking at climate damage done in the past and possible or very likely climate changes and damages in the future, to have a full picture. But mitigation and adaptation is not going to work if we stay on the very same path as Niklas described. It's only going to work when we now say, look, let's mitigate, let's reduce emissions. And this is, actually a reflection of the German debate. During the past months, that is something I've noticed, is that there are some people who sort of, put down the brake and say, look, let's go slow. We're not in a hurry. We can adapt to the climate crisis. These are voices that we heard. Germans love to go fast on the road. They hate being told to slow down. So to say let's slow down and let's just adapt to the climate crisis, this is very ironic. So this is not going to work, and this means that it means a cut in people's freedom. And yes, we will see more injustice if we slow down and try to adapt. Adaptation, this cannot help us slow down the climate crisis. It's actually total nonsense, I think. So these are the 2 points in which the COP did not live up to reality. There's a huge gap between ambitions and reality. We have the fossil energy producers, energy companies, and then all these debates on how to phase out or phase down global gas, global coal, etc. Niklas actually said a lot about that. What were the commitments that the individual countries did not come up with? So yes, it is frustrating. It seems like a backlash in terms of the 1.5 degrees. Now, I'm a politician, focusing more on the national level. Our party is part of the government coalition. So the question is, how is that going to affect, how's that going to impact German politics? Of course, we need to show that we deserve credibility. Well, and I think that Germany is one of the countries who was one of the driving forces of that conference, and together with the European Union, put pressure on other stakeholders to go ahead for deeds, not word. So let's not be the ones who slam down the brakes. We would love to keep being a driving force, but we have to make sure that we're credible. Now, what the two issues that I just raised, if we break this down to the national level, and we just really have to come up with tangible results. So first of all, the phasing out of coal in 2030 in all over Germany, not just in the western part, but also in the former east. And that takes important steps. 2030, Germany needs to quit coal. The Federal Republic needs to quit coal. And at the same time, renewable energies need to be stepped up on a big scale. And that takes investment. And this is something we touched upon at the beginning. 100 billion for climate protection. Let's pick up the money. Let's use the funds. We've seen major parcels, but we need more. Now, the second point, and this is something that people mentioned most at the conference, was global partnership. There's great partnerships for hydrogen, for global energies, and my answer is very clear and transparent. Looking at what's happening in Senegal at the moment, it doesn't make sense to invest into a new gas field. And in terms of climate policies, that would be wrong because this goes against 1.5 degrees. And it would also be a mistake and error in terms of development policy. Look at Senegal, look at other African or southern states. In 10 or 15 years, they will have an infrastructure set up that they can't use anymore. So looking at these countries, it wouldn't be fair. Looking back into history, we've seen time and again that in countries where fossil fuels are produced, maybe with the exception of Norway, do not end in people's pockets. It's just, it ends in the pockets of companies. It might be different with renewable energies, but that raises the question: how can we implement Glasgow? So let's look for transformation partnership. And the third point is that we need to adhere to our own climate pledges, and that leaves a lot of work to do. Let's roll up our sleeves, especially when it comes to traffic and transport. This is something we'll need to do in the coming years. We must really have every spring pledges on green goals, including the traffic and transport sector. Let me mention one last thing, something that we've seen at the COP, shrinking spaces. That sounds very abstract, but we have seen what that could mean in reality. I have seen demonstrations being stopped, people being monitored under surveillance, people who really couldn't, people had been there who couldn't afford to pay extra hotel costs. We've seen people from various ministries, etc., but also groups and people who represent us at the COP. And it's important that we support them and look at how their human rights situation is. We have to avoid that there's revenge or retaliation from the Egyptian government. The blue zone at the COP, with the pavilions, etc. This is United Nations ground, and I think we need stricter rules. Also looking at future COPs, Dubai, looking at what the host country what they're up to. It is a question of rights, but it's also a question of climate protection. Because looking at all climate policies, there's so many things that we need to improve. And, we wouldn't be where we are in Germany if it wasn't for the civil society movements and the climate activists. So the fact that protest, that demonstration is allowed, is possible and necessary, this improves climate policy. So fossil lock-ins must be avoided. We have to bring the climate protection and human rights together. This is the job of the German government.
Das war mal ein klares Statement zu den
Wow,
Punkten.
that was a clear statement.
5 Minuten länger machen lassen,
I
weil
let you speak for 5 minutes longer because it felt like you went through the whole Q&A and replied to the questions that were posed. So I do beg for forgiveness, but thank you very much. That was crystal clear. We now know what exactly needs to be done. We're now moving from Germany to Europe. Michael Bloss was part of the EP delegation at the climate conference. He was one of the negotiators of the German climate law, and he co-negotiated a whole lot with regards to the European Green Deal. Michael, it's great to have you here. We very much look forward to your statement.
Dank und hallo in die Runde. Hallo
Thank you
ans
very
Panel.
much, and greetings to all of you. It's great to see you here. A lot has already been said. I'd like to focus on a few aspects. Firstly, we're currently not adhering to the targets set in Paris. I think it's important to repeat this. In the Paris Agreement, it is clearly stated that we want to remain well below 2 degrees and want to achieve 1.5 degrees. Professor Niklas Höhne just showed this, that we are not doing this. That means that we're not adhering to the Paris Agreement. In 5 years after entering into force, we should be at the goals and only start implementing, but we're still far away from the goals. In Glasgow, we said that until Sharm el-Sheikh will adhere to Paris, but nothing happened.
Und ich glaube, das muss das große Thema sein bis
And I
zur
think
nächsten
that must be the big topic until the next climate conference. We can't have another lost year for climate protection. So we also now need to ensure that until Dubai, the climate goals are increased. Sticking to 1.5 degrees is the biggest protection against losses and damages. Only then will we not have to pay huge amounts. And the European Union also didn't increase its climate goal. All of the member states, Germany, France, and Italy, are all members of the Paris Agreement via the EU, and the EU negotiates on their behalf. And already after the last climate conference, Franz Timmermans said, we've already done a whole lot, now it's up to the others to do more. In my opinion, this isn't the right position. We as the EU must now be pioneers and say, we are going to increase our climate goals drastically and very rapidly, thus allowing us to impose pressure on the others to ensure that they follow suit. Secondly, I was a member of the Parliament delegation. We had the pleasure of speaking with many other delegations. It was very interesting to speak to the US, to China, to Pakistan, to the Maldives, to the Marshall Islands. And what we heard from the partners from the Global South is credibility, trust, i.e., can one trust the European Union that it will really stick to its promise? Because the historic experience has been that you cannot. Because in 2009, we promised that as of 2020, every year, $100 billion would be made available for international climate protection, which did not take place. It is clear that if we want to fulfill the 1.5 degrees target, then there can't be new investments into gas from the countries in the global north. Here too, we are losing credibility, and that is indeed a huge issue. Because as described hitherto, it means that countries who already have huge issues because of the climate crisis, Bangladesh, the Maldives, that we cannot forge alliances with them against other countries that have no interest in lowering the CO2 emissions, such as Saudi Arabia, but that the development countries, so to speak, remain within their group. So this begs the question, how can we ensure that we can regain trust? And this will require us increasing our climate goals. It will mean that at home, we need to do everything that we can do. We need to switch to emergency mode, as Professor Höhne said, and it is important that we pay into this loss and damage fund. A lot has been said about this loss and damage fund. It is a historical breakthrough, but the condition of the European Union was always, we can only agree to this fund if it is clear that countries like China and Saudi Arabia also pay into this fund instead of actually receiving money from this fund. This question was not responded to during the climate conference. There was some talk about focusing on the countries that are most affected by the climate crisis, and that one also wants to ensure that the funding possibilities are extended. But the EU's position actually is that we'll only pay into this fund if China and other big emitters also pay into this fund. And I think here too, we should say, we are going to pay justice to our historical responsibility and pay into this fund. And at the same time, we should ensure that China and Arabia also pay into this fund on a voluntary basis. So we should exert pressure here, certainly. And then the third thing, which has been said already, is that the COP wasn't prepared thoroughly. Ahead of this climate conference, unfortunately, there were far too few common alliances or initiatives coming from the European Union, together with the small island states. It would have been good if, ahead of the conference, there would have been announcements in the press from Franz Timmermans to impose pressure on the others. Instead, the only focus was the energy crisis, and I think this now must change. These alliances must now be forged already. We must now invest into measures to build trust. People have to be invited to ensure that the next climate conference is well prepared, to ensure that it does become a success and that we get closer to the 1.5 degrees goal. Perhaps one last thing that I found extremely interesting, which wasn't discussed in the framework of the climate conference, but was certainly a topic that was approached, and that is the question how fast we're actually moving ahead in the transformation of the industry towards climate neutrality. In the EU, we always said, we're doing this, the EU is going to become the first climate neutral continent. We're transitioning, and we can see that the US just has a huge investment program in order to promote battery cells, in order to promote heat pumps and solar and wind energy.
Große Geschwindigkeit an uns vorbeiziehen.
And the US is actually moving ahead at great speed, and they're doing this in a very clever fashion. They're building those climate industries in states that are dominated by Republicans. But we, as Europeans, are also challenged. We too must change gears and clearly formulate how we are going to ensure that the different industries do transition. And we must also discuss how these new industries or where these new industries can be located. So this too has to happen now here in Europe. We cannot afford to pause climate protection for a year because we are experiencing an energy crisis. No, we must shift gears and give it our all. Thank you very much. That was a very interesting insight with some additional points. we have a whole lot of questions, which is why I'm struggling here. Now, I picked one question for our 4 guests, and well, we have about 10 minutes left, perhaps 13. So perhaps you could be brief in your answer. So first question to Professor Höhne. Malte asked whether there were discussions as to whether oil-producing companies such as BP Oil and Exxon would have to pay into a loss and damage fund, and if yes, what states were part of this? What states were progressive and which ones did not want that? So the question is, do we also involve private actors?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. Because these groups, these industry are co-responsible, especially now, you know, they're skimming off huge profits. Now, the first reaction when it comes to climate negotiations is that it's the states, the nations who should pay. But the United States are very reticent, you know, they were very careful to confirm or not to confirm that they will use tax money and they will find another solution. Now, a global CO2 tax, whatever way you do it, fossil industries or at other places in the chain, well, this is something that's been part of the debate for a long time now, but it's very hard to implement. So we have to be creative when it comes to finding means and ways to see how we can get those funds into the bucket, into the fund. So, but yeah, that's one of the most important aspects. That's true. You know, take those the large fossil industries and have them on board to finance all sorts of aspects, including loss and damage. Now, the phasing out was heeded by India, and that was a big surprise. During the last conference, when it came to phase out of coal, India wasn't exactly enthusiastic, and now India said, "Look, let's talk about all fossil energies." Perhaps there was just a maneuver because they thought, well, it's not going to happen anyway. But 80 states, including the United States, Norway, Australia, Canada, said yes. That's what we need as an agreement. Well, the Egyptian presidency never put it in writing. And the agreement, okay, that's my opinion, so we haven't seen it happening, but it might happen next time. It's nothing new, really. I mean, if you say 1.5 degrees, it means a phasing down and a total phase out of coal, oil, and gas immediately. Well, those who are against, maybe they didn't get it, or maybe they don't want to get it. Thank you very much. The next question will be to Mitzi. So it's a couple of questions, really. The civil society in Egypt and next year in Dubai. Ricarda talked about the Blue Zone, the United Nations rule. You as a movement, you as a group, did you get the impression that those responsible from the UN have supported you when it came to repressions, you know, when you what was their reaction like? You look after yourselves, not our business. So what was the impression that you had on the ground? In Copenhagen, it was very clear, I think, that the hosts had realized what was happening and that there was protest. So not just the Danish authorities, but also the United Nations Authority. What was your impression?
It's difficult to say because you saw how the presidency of the COP with Egypt, they weren't as welcoming to the protests. I think they'd like to show and pretend that they were, but you could feel that the security that came from Egypt, they were a lot harsher. After the Global Day of Action that happened on the 12th of November, I spoke as the youth representative to the audience, and I spoke about political freedom as well as climate justice. And I had a traditional Filipina attire that had climate justice and social justice written on the sleeves. And after the protest, they wouldn't actually let me inside because of what I was wearing. And I was like, what's the difference? Everyone else is also wearing a shirt that says climate justice. What do you want me to do? And you could see that they really did not want us to go in. And they were like, you can go around the entire space to get to the place you were trying to get to. And I was like, that doesn't make sense. Everyone is allowed to enter into these pavilions. But it was when the UN security stepped in, and that was when it kind of got a little bit clearer. I think it's hard to say because you don't know who is from the UNFCCC, from the UN, from the Egyptian presidency. But you can really see that they're not used to young girls, especially, fighting back and using our voices to demand for our rights. In terms of the protests and UN, like the UN processes, it was pretty simple. We were able to talk with the UN official processes and how to create these actions. There were rules, of course, that we had to follow, but that's the same thing that happens at every COP every year. And you could see that they were also trying to make sure that we could still have our voices be heard. So it really depends on who you were talking to in the situation.
Danke, das war, glaube ich, auch nochmal ein sehr wichtiger
Thank you. I
Einblick.
think that was a very important aspect and perspective. Ricarda Lang, Roland Vossebecker, and Christian Bernhard have asked questions that were repeated in the chat. So this emergency mode, this intensive care mode, is this going to work at our level of consumption in terms of sufficiency? What do we actually need as consumers in the north? And then the speed limit is taken up. You know, this is sort of a luxury issue, if I can say so. What's your opinion on that? Sufficiency, you know, live with less, but still live a good life and protect the climate at the same time. How does that translate into policy? Well, the first point is, efficiency, the circular economy, ecological green solution. It's possible, you know, and it's our job to combine them in a way that it can work for the economy as well. But secondly, it's clear that the lifestyle we have in the global north, this is not something we can live everywhere. You know, it's not going to work everywhere in the world, especially at the speed that we need to act, that we need to use to fight climate change. Well, let's say we're in a laboratory and we had the luxury of time to look over 20 years, you know, to the decoupling of luxury of consumption and climate protection. This is not going to work. We don't have that time. So the question is, what are we okay to renounce? You know, what can we live without? But it's a question of sharing, of allocation of resources. Now, it's not about every person living in Germany, for example, has the same share of responsibility. We're looking at people who have a minimum wage, you know, they find it hard to survive. Let me give an example. What we see in Germany is the richest 10%, if they used as much gas, natural gas, if they cut down on gas in a way that 40% of population do, we'd have saved a lot of gas, a lot of natural gas. So we can perhaps just look at who needs social support during the transition. But what about those who earn a lot of money, who are also responsible, like the fossil fuel industry? How can we get them to take ownership? Then the speed limit, of course, it's absurd. It's absurd. You know, looking at Germans and their cars and motorways, Autobahn, you know, of course, there are measures that are more urgent, but emotionally speaking, what let me say, if we don't manage to come up with a really simple solution, you know, transform the industry, this is very difficult. But to get a speed limit on our roads, you know, it's so simple. We're looking for a political majority. We're still fighting for that because this is a fairly simple measure, and with that measure, with the speed limit, we can achieve a lot. So if you don't want a speed limit, then you gotta provide other um, ideas for the transport and traffic policy.
Das war sehr klar. Und jetzt gebe ich das genau
That was
halb.
very, very clear. It's 5:30 now. So, Michael, if you don't have to leave immediately, I'll give you the floor for some closing remarks, after which we'll switch off because we're only meeting for an hour today. I can also ask you a question if you want, Michael. That way you have something to reply to. Now, LNG terminals in Germany could be built in 6, 7, or 8 months. Can we do that for renewables too? And can we do that at an European level? I know that the EU is also doing something with regards to approval procedures. So the question is perhaps, how can we be faster?
Ja, genau, also diese LNG-Geschwindigkeit,
This LNG speed is, of course, something that we also want for the expansion of renewable energies. And the European Commission 2 weeks ago proposed that we shorten the approval as a temporary measure for 2023, also as a reaction to the crisis. The proposal is that when it comes to solar energy on roofs, there is an approval period of 1 month. If it isn't approved by then, it is considered as approved.
Von Wind ist es das Gleiche.
And when it comes to repowering wind, the same thing is the case. If it is less than 15% additional power for new, it is to be half a year. And in addition, renewable energies are to be categorized as serving public interest and to be also prioritized above other interests. That would be great for 2023 and will also be extremely important because instead of traveling around the world to shop for gas, we should do our utmost to expand renewable energies and to replace gas. And we'll manage that by being fast in expanding renewable energies. So that's something we must do by the next winter. And perhaps as a final remark, this year was a lost year for climate production, and we cannot afford to do this in the 2020s. And to solve the energy crisis, we need to develop renewable energies because they are the freedom energies that will make us independent also from Russia and others. They're also the most cheap energy forms. There's also a location benefit for the industry. So it is a win-win-win, but we must do it now. And I'm worried if the fossil industry last year made a profit of $2 billion, well, because they're also going to spend this money to continue existing. So it's all about supporting renewables now in order to push back the influence of the fossil industry. And if we do this together, we'll also be credible at an international stage. And hopefully then, during the next climate conference, we can report that we have edged a lot closer to the targets we've set ourselves, but the work has to commence now. That's a great final comment. I would like to thank our guests. Thank you very much for being here. We had over 1,000 people listening to us in this webinar. Thank you very much for taking the time, and see you next time and have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Schönen Abend noch allen.